The final turn of the lock on her own front door sounded like a bone snapping. Silas, her late husband's brother, did not meet her eyes. He pressed 20 silver dollars and a folded piece of paper into her palm. His hand was clammy and quick, like a thief's. The coins were cold, each one a tiny stone of dismissal. The paper was the deed to a spit of useless land nobody in Prosperity Gulch had ever wanted. "It's all that's left, Ilara," Silas mumbled, his gaze fixed on the dust motes dancing in the sliver of light from the now barred door. "The creditors took the rest. This was grandfather's folly. It's yours now." She looked down at the deed. It described a plot of land 3 miles north of town, a place known only as the Fissure. It was a gash in the stony face of the Grayback Ridge, a place of wind and rock and nothing more. A place where even the hardiest scrub pine refused to grow. It was a joke, a piece of land so worthless it wasn't even taxed. This, and $20, was what her life, her marriage, and her husband's sweat had amounted to. At her feet, Boulder, her husband's old hound, whined softly, pressing his heavy head against her leg. He was all she had left of the man she had loved, this dog and this worthless deed. The town was already turning away. She saw it in the averted gazes of the women she'd quilted with, the curt nods from the man who had once shared a drink with her husband. A widow with no family and no money was a burden, a ghost at the feast of their modest prosperity. Mrs. Gable, the mercantile owner's wife, stopped her on the boardwalk, her face a mask of practiced pity. "My dear Ilara," she cooed, her voice thin as spun sugar. "You should take the stage east. Go to the city. A woman alone has no place here, especially now." It was advice meant to sound like kindness, but it was just another way of saying, leave. Sheriff Miller tipped his hat. "Sorry for your troubles, ma'am. If you need a place to stay for a night or two, the church has a cot in the back." The offer was a deadline, a night or two. Then she would be a problem he had to solve. She felt the eyes of Prosperity Gulch on her back, a physical weight of judgment and expectation. They expected her to break. They expected her to weep, to beg, to take that stagecoach east and disappear from their lives. She looked at the 20 silver dollars in her palm. It was just enough for a ticket, with a few coins left over for a meal. Or it was enough for an axe, a shovel, a sack of flour, and a pound of salt. A quiet fire, banked low for weeks in the ash of her grief, stirred to life. It was not a fire of hope, not yet. It was a stubborn, smokeless coal of refusal. She would not be erased. She would not be a ghost. She walked past the stagecoach office, its cheerful posters promising new lives in faraway places. She walked directly into Gable's Mercantile, the bell above the door announcing her with a sharp, defiant jingle. Mr. Gable looked up from his ledger, his spectacles perched on his nose. "An axe," she said, her voice clear and steady, "the best one you have, and a shovel with a reinforced handle." He raised an eyebrow. "Clearing some brush, are we?" The question was laced with condescension. "No," she replied, meeting his gaze. "I'm building." She spent 18 of her $20. The axe was heavy, its hickory handle smooth and promising in her hands. She bought flour, salt, beans, a small cast-iron pot, a sharpening stone, and a thick wool blanket. When she left the store, the weight of the supplies in her pack was a comfort, a real and solid burden that replaced the hollow ache in her chest. She turned her back on the silent, watching town. With Boulder trotting faithfully at her side, she walked north, toward the worthless land, toward the Fissure. The journey was a punishment. The trail to the Grayback Ridge was not a trail at all, but a suggestion of a path choked with thorny bushes and loose scree. The weight of her pack dug into her shoulders, raw and unforgiving. Each step was an effort of will. The sun beat down. Then the sky turned a bruised purple, and a cold rain began to fall, soaking her to the bone. Boulder stayed close, his presence a silent, unwavering reassurance. By the time she reached the plot of land described on the deed, dusk was bleeding into a starless night. And she saw it. It was worse than the stories. The fissure was a scar, a tight vertical crack in a sheer cliff face of gray, unforgiving granite. It was perhaps 2 feet wide at its mouth and disappeared into darkness. The land around it was a graveyard of broken rock and thin, acidic soil. Nothing grew here. Nothing lived here. A wave of despair, cold and vast as the ocean, washed over her. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the wet, sharp stones. The town was right. Silas was right. This was a place to die, not to live. The wind howled around the rock face, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to mock her foolishness. Tears she had refused to shed in town now came, hot and bitter, mixing with the cold rain on her face. She had traded her last dollars for a tombstone. Boulder nudged her hand, whining low in his throat. He then padded over to the mouth of the fissure and stood there, his tail giving a tentative wag. He sniffed the air coming from the dark crack, then looked back at her, as if waiting. Shivering, exhausted, Ilara pushed herself to her feet and stumbled toward the rock face. As she drew closer, she felt it. The wind, which had been clawing at her from every direction, suddenly ceased. In the lee of the cliff, the air was utterly still. She held her wet, trembling hand up to the crack. From within the stone, a slow, steady breath of air flowed out. It was not warm, not like a hearth, but it was distinctly less cold than the biting wind. It was cool, damp, and smelled of deep earth and stone, but it did not carry the winter's chill. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She pressed her cheek against the cold granite next to the opening and felt for a draught. There was none. The rock itself was a shield. She squeezed her way into the narrow opening, Boulder following so closely his fur brushed her legs. Inside, the darkness was absolute, but the air was calm. The howling of the wind became a distant, muffled moan. She fumbled in her pack for a match and a candle stub. The tiny flame flickered, then held steady, casting a weak, dancing light on the walls. The fissure was not just a crack. It widened as it went, opening into a small, cave-like chamber, perhaps 10 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The walls were solid granite, the ceiling a natural arch of stone high above her head. And then she heard it, a sound so faint she almost missed it. Drip, drip, drip. A slow, rhythmic pulse from the back of the chamber. She followed the sound, her candle held high. There, in the deepest part of the cave, a thin, constant trickle of clear water seeped from a crack in the rock, collecting in a small, shallow pool on the stone floor before disappearing into another fissure. She touched the water. It was icy cold, but it was clean. It was life. Thermal mass, wind protection, a source of fresh water. The town saw a worthless hole in a rock, a place of death, but the rock held a secret. The rock was a fortress. The rock was a foundation. The despair that had crippled her moments before receded, replaced by a grim, fierce resolve. This was not a tomb. It was a beginning. The first week was a blur of brutal, mind-numbing labor. Her hands, soft from a life of mending clothes and kneading dough, were shredded within the first day. Blisters formed, broke, and bled, leaving her palms raw and screaming with pain. She learned to wrap them in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat. Her muscles ached with a fire she had never known, a deep cellular protest against the unaccustomed strain. Her first task was to widen the entrance. The fissure was too narrow for anything but a single person to squeeze through. She needed to bring in wood, supplies, animals. Using a small pry bar she had fashioned from a fallen ironwood branch and a heavy rock as a hammer, she began the painstaking work of chipping away at the edges of the opening. It was granite, and it fought her for every single inch. Sparks flew, steel rang against stone, and her arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. Each swing was a grunt of effort, each tiny flake of dislodged rock a victory. Section Boulder would lie nearby, watching her, his brown eyes filled with a dog's patient concern. Sometimes, when she would collapse, exhausted, he would come and lick the salt of her sweat from her face, a silent encouragement to continue. After 4 days of this torturous work, she had widened the entrance by a foot. It was enough. Now, she needed walls. The cave itself was shelter, but the front needed to be sealed against the worst of the weather and any predators that might wander by. She began felling the sparse, hardy pines that grew in the more sheltered hollows below the ridge. The new axe felt like an extension of her arm. The clean, sharp bite into wood, the spray of fragrant chips, the final groaning crack as a tree gave way. It was a satisfying, powerful rhythm. Getting the logs up the slope to the fissure was another ordeal. She had no horse, no mule. She had only her own strength. She would lever one end of a log onto a flat stone, then lift the other, half walking, half dragging it a few feet at a time. Her back screamed. Her legs trembled with exhaustion so deep it became a kind of numbness. But with every log she moved, she felt a change in herself. The softness was burning away, leaving something harder, something more resilient in its place. She laid the first logs across the widened entrance, building a foundation. Then she began constructing the facade, a short, sturdy wall of wood and stone. She gathered rocks, hundreds of them, from the scree field at the base of the cliff. She carried them one by one, her arms straining, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She learned the art of fitting them together, finding the right shape, the right angle, to create a stable, interlocking wall. For mortar, she discovered a deposit of dense, gray clay near the spring's overflow. She mixed it with water and pine needles, creating a thick, sticky paste. She packed this into the gaps between the stones and the logs, chinking every possible crack against the wind. It was slow, messy work. The clay dried on her hands, cracking and pulling at her raw skin. But when she was done, the wall was solid. It was a shield. Next came the most critical system, heat. A fire inside the cave was dangerous. The smoke would fill the chamber and kill her. But as she explored the cave system, she found her solution. In the main chamber, near the back wall, a narrow fissure snaked its way up into the darkness of the ceiling. Holding her candle near it, she could feel a faint but steady draft pulling the flame upwards. It was a natural chimney. She built her hearth and fireplace against that wall, using the flattest, most massive stones she could find. She built it with painstaking care, creating a deep firebox and a carefully angled throat to draw the smoke. The stone of the cliff face itself would become part of the fireplace, a massive thermal battery. It would soak up the heat from the fire and then radiate it back into the cave long after the flames had died down. The day she finished the fireplace, a cold autumn wind was whipping down from the peaks. She stacked a small pile of dry kindling inside, struck a match, and held her breath. A small flame flickered, caught, and then a plume of smoke, instead of billowing into the cave, was pulled cleanly up and into the fissure. It worked. A wave of triumphant relief washed over her, so powerful it made her dizzy. She sat on the stone floor, watching the flames dance, feeling the first real warmth she had known in weeks. That night, for the first time, She slept inside her shelter, sealed away from the wind, the fire casting a warm, golden glow on the stone walls. Boulder slept at her feet, his heavy body a comforting weight. She was still alone, but she was no longer exposed. Water came next. The seep at the back of the cave was reliable, but the pool was shallow and open. She used her shovel to deepen it, digging out a cistern in the stone floor. She lined the entire basin with a thick layer of the same gray clay she'd used for mortar, packing it down until it was smooth and watertight. The seep now filled a clean, protected reservoir, providing her with a constant supply of fresh, cold water, safe from contamination and impossible to freeze. Food was the greatest challenge. Winter was coming, and she couldn't survive on beans and flour alone. Hunting was not her skill. But the cave offered another secret. Deeper inside, past the main chamber, was a second, lower cavern. The air here was still and held the same constant, cool temperature. It never froze. She had an idea, a desperate, perhaps foolish one. Over the next 2 weeks, she undertook her most arduous task yet. She filled buckets with the richer topsoil from a small, sheltered meadow a quarter-mile down the ridge. She hauled them back, bucket by agonizing bucket, and dumped the soil onto the floor of the second cavern. She created a series of long, raised beds, a hidden garden protected from the wind, the snow, and the killing frost. A subterranean farm. She had no seeds for wheat, but she had saved the seeds from every wild root and hardy green she had found on her journey. She planted them in neat rows in the darkness, trusting the earth. She knew she needed more. She needed a source of protein, of fat. She needed animals. This meant a trip back to town. Walking into Prosperity Gulch was like entering a foreign country. She was leaner, her face tanned and weathered by the wind. Her hands were calloused and scarred. Her clothes were stained with dirt and clay. People stared. Whispers followed her down the boardwalk like stray dogs. She walked into Gable's Mercantile. The bell jingled. Mr. Gable looked up, and his jaw tightened. He saw the change in her, and it seemed to displease him. "I need to buy 2 laying hens and a pregnant goat, if you have one," she said, her voice rough from disuse. Gable leaned on the counter, a smirk playing on his lips. "Livestock? Up at that crack in the rock? What are you going to feed them, Alara? Stones? What's to stop a wolf from taking them the first night?" "That is my concern," she said evenly, placing her few remaining coins and some carefully bartered firewood on the counter. "Do you have them or not?" The transaction was cold and clipped. He sold her 2 scrawny hens and a nervous-looking nanny goat, already heavy with kid. As he counted her money, he said, loud enough for the other customers to hear, "Folks are calling it the widow's hole now. Seems fitting." A flush of anger, hot and sharp, rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She would not give him the satisfaction. She simply nodded, tied a rope to the goat's collar, tucked the chickens into a crate, and walked out. The journey back was a strange parade. A woman, a dog, a goat, and 2 chickens, heading into the wilderness. It was a picture of foolishness to anyone who saw it. To Alara, it was a picture of survival. She built a pen for the animals in a small side chamber off the main cave, using woven saplings and more stacked stone. The body heat from the goat and chickens added a surprising amount of warmth to the air. The smell was earthy, alive. Their soft noises, the clucking of the hens, the gentle bleating of the goat, broke the profound silence of the stone. They were company. With the animals secured, her systems were nearly complete. Shelter, heat, water, food, animal husbandry. She had built a world inside the rock. The mockery from the town didn't stop. It became a kind of local sport. Brant, a trapper who considered himself the master of the wilderness, made a special trip up to her claim. He stood outside her sturdy log and stone wall, peered at her small, mica-paned window, and laughed out loud. "You call that a door?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the rock. "A good wind will take it down. You'll freeze in there, girl. Mark my words. You can't tame the graybacks with mud and sticks." She didn't answer. She simply watched him from the window until he grew tired of his own voice and left. His dismissal was a gift. It meant they would leave her alone. Winter arrived not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a fist. The temperature plummeted. The wind became a constant, screaming predator. But inside the widow's hole, a quiet, orderly life took root. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity. At dawn, she would rise and stoke the fire, the stones of the hearth radiating a deep, comforting warmth. She would milk the goat, whose name became Serenity, and collect the precious, perfect egg that one of her hens, Beatrice, laid almost every day. She would feed the animals, check her water cistern, and tend to her hidden garden. In the dim, still air of the underground beds, life was stirring. Pale green shoots were pushing up through the dark soil. It was a miracle, a testament to the stubborn will of a seed. The routine was her anchor in the vast, isolating silence of the winter. The world outside her stone walls ceased to exist. Her world was the glow of the fire, the sound of Serenity chewing her cud, the weight of a fresh egg in her palm, the steady drip of water into her cistern. She faced smaller tests. One night, a pack of wolves, drawn by the scent of the goat, circled her shelter. Their howls were a terrifying symphony just outside her wall. Boulder stood at the door, a low, rumbling growl in his chest, the fur on his back ridged with defiance. Ilara stood with him, her hand on his strong back, the axe within easy reach. They scratched and clawed at the door and the stone facade, but the walls held. The heavy, braced door did not splinter. After an hour, they gave up, and their howls faded into the distance. She leaned her head against the cool, solid wood of the door, her heart pounding. Her systems had been tested. They had held. A week later, an early blizzard buried the landscape in 3 feet of snow. It was a preview of what was to come. For 3 days, she was sealed inside completely. But it made no difference to her routine. The fire burned, the animals were safe, the water flowed, and her garden grew. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply living outside of its reach. The deep solitude did not break her, it forged her. She learned the contours of her own strength, the depths of her own resilience. She was the sovereign of her small stone kingdom. Then came the blizzard of '83. It was a storm out of legend, a white monster that descended from the north without warning. It was not snow. It was a wall of ice and wind that hit Prosperity Gulch like a hammer. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, a high, thin shriek that tore at the nerves and sounded like the world was ending. Inside her shelter, Ilara felt the mountain tremble under the assault. The wind slammed against her facade, a relentless, physical blow. But the stone of the cliff took the brunt of the force, and her low, sturdy wall, anchored to the mountain itself, did not yield. The fire in her hearth drew perfectly, the natural chimney pulling the smoke away, while the massive stone hearth radiated a steady, enveloping warmth. Serenity had given birth to 2 healthy kids, and their soft bleating was a counterpoint to the storm's fury. Her hands clucked, safe in their pen. The air was warm, smelling of wood smoke, animals, and damp earth. She was secure. In Prosperity Gulch, it was a different story. The town was built of wood, designed for ordinary winters, not for this. The first thing to go was the confidence. The wind, like a thief, found every crack and chink in their cabins. It stole the heat as fast as they could burn their wood. Sheriff Miller's roof on the meeting hall, the pride of the town, began to groan under the impossible weight of the snow. Then the structures themselves began to fail. The roof of the livery stable collapsed with a sound like thunder, crushing 2 horses inside. The wind tore the steeple clean off the church, sending it cartwheeling into the darkness. Families huddled in their homes, stuffing rags into the gaps around their doors and windows, listening to the sound of their world being ripped apart. Firewood, stacked for a normal winter, began to run out with terrifying speed. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that seeped through the walls and floors. Livestock in their barns began to freeze to death. The town's preparations, born of arrogance and tradition, were proving to be worthless. Their safe, conventional way of living was a trap. Their world was shrinking to a single, desperate battle against the cold, and they were losing. Ilara knew nothing of this. Her world remained ordered and calm. The storm was an abstract force, a noise outside her walls. Her systems, born of desperation and ingenuity, were working in perfect harmony. The thermal mass of the mountain held the heat. The cistern provided endless water. The animals were warm and productive. Her small, pale vegetables in the cave garden were ready for harvest. She was not just surviving, she was living, insulated from the apocalypse that raged just a few feet away. The contrast was absolute. Inside, warmth and life. Outside, chaos and death. She was not fighting the storm. She was in a place the storm could not touch. On the 4th day of the blizzard, the sound of the wind was joined by something else, a frantic, desperate pounding on her door. It was a sound so alien in her solitary world that for a moment she thought she was imagining it. But it came again, weaker this time, accompanied by a frantic scratching. Boulder was already at the door, not with a threatening growl, but with a series of sharp, concerned barks. Ilara grabbed her heaviest cloak and the axe, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who could possibly be out in this? She heaved against the heavy bar securing the door and pulled it inward. A figure, completely covered in snow and ice, stumbled in and collapsed onto the stone floor. It was a boy, no older than 10, his face blue with cold, his breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. As the snow melted from his face, she recognized him. It was Thomas Gable, the mercantile owner's son. "Help," he whispered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Please, Mama, she's sick. The fire's out. Pa, he went for wood. He's not back." Ilara's world tilted. Gable, the man who had mocked her, who had named her home a hole, who had led the chorus of doubt against her. His family was freezing. His son was at her door, begging for help. For a fleeting second, a bitter, cold satisfaction flickered within her. The memory of his smug face, the sound of the town's laughter, it was all there. She had her own food, her own wood, carefully rationed to last the winter. Helping them would put her own survival at risk. It would cost her. But the flicker died as quickly as it came. She looked at the boy, shivering violently on her floor, his eyes wide with terror. She looked at the warmth of her fire, at the quiet strength of her stone walls. She had built this place not just to survive, but to live. And what was a life without compassion? The choice was not a choice at all. It was a duty. She had built a fortress, and a fortress that does not shelter the weak is nothing but a prison. "Get by the fire," she told the boy, her voice gentle but firm. She wrapped him in her own wool blanket and ladled a hot broth from the pot simmering over the hearth. As he drank, his shivering began to subside. She turned and began to prepare. She packed a small sled she had built with precious, dry firewood. She filled a canteen with the hot broth and wrapped it in cloth to keep it warm. She took down a lantern and lit it. "Stay here with the dog," she commanded Thomas. "Keep the fire fed. I'm going for your father." She stepped out into the screaming maelstrom. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and driving ice crystals into her eyes. It was like stepping onto another planet. The world was a churning, blinding whiteness. But she had the boy's tracks, faint depressions already being filled by the storm, to follow. She leaned into the wind and pushed forward, Boulder at her side, a dark shape in the chaos, his head low as he sniffed the trail. The journey was a nightmare. Every step was a battle against the wind and the deep, clinging snow. But she was no longer the woman who had first arrived at this ridge. The labor of building her home had hardened her, taught her how to read the land, how to move with purpose. After what felt like an eternity, Boulder stopped, barking furiously at a large snowdrift near a stand of skeletal-looking pines. Ilara rushed forward and began digging with her bare hands. Under a foot of snow, she found him, Mr. Gable. He was unconscious, a half-filled sack of frozen branches clutched in his hand. His face was waxy and pale. She worked quickly, her movements precise and efficient. She got the broth into him, forcing a few warm swallows past his lips. She loaded him onto the small sled, a dead weight that threatened to sink into the snow. The journey back was even harder. She was pulling a grown man against a storm that seemed determined to kill them all. She fell, got up, and pulled again. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, but she did not stop. When she finally stumbled back through her own doorway, dragging the sled behind her, she was coated in ice, her strength utterly spent. She barred the door, sealing out the storm once more, and collapsed. When Mr. Gable awoke, it was to a reality his mind could not comprehend. The first thing he registered was the warmth. A deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to come from the very stones around him. The second was the light, a soft, steady glow from a fire in a masterfully built stone hearth. He was wrapped in a dry blanket, and his son was sleeping safely at the foot of the cot he lay on. He sat up slowly, his body aching. He looked around the chamber. It was not a hole. It was a home. He saw the neat stacks of firewood, the tidy shelves carved into the rock holding jars of preserved goods, the sturdy wooden furniture she had built herself. He heard the soft clucking of chickens and the bleating of goats from an adjoining chamber. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting root vegetables. Ilara was tending the fire, her back to him. She moved with a quiet, confident grace. He watched as she walked into a darker part of the cave and returned with a basket of fresh, pale greens and knobby carrots pulled from the earth in the dead of winter. A garden. She had a garden under the ground. The sheer, impossible reality of it all struck him like a physical blow. They had all laughed. They had called her a fool, the mad widow in her hole. They had sat in their flimsy wooden boxes, so proud of their conventional wisdom, while they slowly froze to death. And she, with nothing but her own 2 hands and a worthless piece of rock, had built a paradise. She had not conquered the wilderness. She had made a pact with it. Shame, hot and profound, washed over him. He was the wise one, the town elder, the man of commerce, and he would have died in the snow, a fool clutching frozen twigs, if not for the woman he had openly mocked. "We were wrong," he said. His voice was a hoarse croak. Ilara turned to look at him. Her face was calm, unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." She simply looked at him, a man she had just saved, a man whose family was in peril. "My wife," Gable whispered, his voice cracking. "Our fire is out. She is sick." Ilara's response was not words, but action. She nodded, then picked up a bowl and filled it with a thick, fragrant stew from the pot over the fire. She handed it to him. "There is stew," she said simply. "Eat, then we will bring your family here." That was her grace. It was not forgiveness. It was something deeper. It was a practical, life-giving kindness that existed beyond pride and shame. It was the quiet strength of someone who had faced the worst and had not been broken, but had been made whole. Gable took the bowl, his hands trembling, and in that moment he understood that he was not in the widow's hole. He was in the safest place on earth. When the blizzard finally broke 2 days later, the world was a silent, white ruin. Prosperity Gulch looked like a battlefield. Roofs had collapsed. Cabins were buried to their eaves. The silence was eerie, broken only by the mournful wind whistling through the shattered church steeple. Ilara's shelter became a refuge. With Gable's help, they brought his wife and younger daughter through the deep snow. Then they went back for others. They found the trapper, Brant, delirious with fever and frostbite in his cabin, his bravado frozen solid. They brought him back. They brought back 3 other families whose homes had become iceboxes. Her small cave, her hole, was soon filled with the people who had scorned her. They huddled around her fire, ate her food, and stared in stunned silence at the world she had built. They saw the calm animals, the impossible garden, the limitless water. They saw a system of survival so elegant and robust, it made their entire way of life seem like a child's game. The name The Widow's Hole was never spoken again with derision. When it was spoken at all, it was with a tone of awe and reverence, as if referring to a holy place. Mr. Gable, humbled and changed, never regained his position as the town's chief dispenser of wisdom. His authority had frozen to death out in the snow. In the spring, when the great melt came, the people of Prosperity Gulch did not just rebuild, they learned. They came to Ilara not with pity, but with questions. They asked about thermal mass, about building with stone, about finding the natural advantages of the land instead of fighting it. She shared her knowledge freely, without pride or payment. She showed them how to build into hillsides, how to construct stone hearths that held the heat, how to find and protect water sources. The town began to change. New homes were built with stone foundations and thick, earth-banked walls. The rebuilt meeting hall was a solid, semi-subterranean structure that could withstand any storm. Her methods, born of one woman's necessity, became the community's salvation. Her story traveled. Traders and trappers carried the tale of the woman in the rock and her underground farm to other settlements. The fissure became a landmark, a place people would visit just to see the sturdy wall and the wisp of smoke rising from the invisible chimney. Ilara never sought fame or leadership. She simply continued her quiet, orderly life, her world rich with the rhythms of the seasons and the fruits of her own labor. She had arrived with nothing but a worthless deed and a refusal to be broken. She had been given a tomb and had turned it into a cradle of life. In the end, her legacy was not written in laws or etched on a grand monument. It was written in the very stones of the town that had once cast her out. It was a testament to the quiet strength of a single soul, the profound value of what others discard, and the moral courage to offer warmth to those who had given her only cold. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a life, proving that the deepest foundations are not made of wood or stone, but of an unbreakable will. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in the power of resilience and quiet strength, and follow for more inspirational stories of courage, survival, and wisdom.